Let's dive right into this fascinating explainer. We are looking at a text that is, quite literally, two completely different documents living inside a single cover. On one hand, we've got a colonial travelogue of Lahore, written back in 1860 by British administrators J.L. Kipling and T.H. Thornton. But then, on the other hand, we have a modern foreword by Dr. Mubarak Ali that directly challenges the underlying assumptions of that very same travelogue. It is just a brilliant case study in how history is recorded, and honestly, more importantly, who gets to record it. To understand this complex history, we'll look at four key areas. 1. A city in tumult. 2. The colonial lens. 3. Documenting daily life. And 4. Poetry and resistance. Before we get into the hard data, I want to ground us in the visual reality of Lahore, right around 1858. This watercolor gives us a gorgeous glimpse into the everyday humanity, the architecture, and the actual lived experience of the native population. Keep this human element in the back of your mind, because as we're about to see, the official records often scrub this vitality right out of the picture.
Section 1. A City in Tumult. The Road to 1860.
We really need to understand how a century of absolute chaos set the stage for British rule in this region. The modern foreword lays out a pretty severe timeline of instability. Starting with the decline of the Mughal Empire around 1707, Lahore suffered through marauding armies, the invasions of Nadir Shah in 1738, and a whole series of civil wars. There was a brief period of peace under Ranjit Singh starting in 1799, but it wasn't long before the British formally annexed the Punjab in 1849. So we're talking about 150 years of relentless turmoil.
Dr. Mubarak Ali emphasizes this beautifully in the foreword. By the time the British showed up, Lahore was essentially a desolate survivor of immense political stress. The arts had lost their patronage, craftsmen were totally out of work, and the city was just exhausted. The British didn't find a city in a natural state of decline, they found a city recovering from severe trauma.
Section 2. The Colonial Lens, Documenting with Superiority.
Now, our authors, Kipling and Thornton, didn't exactly walk into this newly conquered city as neutral observers. After facing some of the fiercest resistance in all of India from the Punjabis, the British ruling elite carried a very distinct colonial viewpoint. They were utterly convinced of their own racial and military superiority. They saw themselves as carrying the white man's burden, right? Acting as the harbingers of change meant to rescue a failing society. Through policies like Macaulay's Minute, they set up an educational and administrative system where locals were expected to view their own world entirely through colonial eyes and the English language.
And this text highlights that the travelogue was written from a highly isolated, superior vantage point. Especially after the uprising of 1857, the British adopted a strict policy of social exclusion. They built their own separate residential areas, their own clubs. They were completely disconnected from the cultural norms of the native people, which created this incredibly rigid wall between us and them.
Section 3. Documenting Daily Life, The Clinical Gaze.
When you actually dive into the travelogue itself, you see exactly how this detached administrative mindset shaped their records of the city's physical reality. The British authors documented Lahore almost like they were logging specimens in a laboratory. They meticulously tracked environmental data like the city's rainfall over a 5-year period from 1870 to 1874. It's a highly clinical approach that takes a living, breathing city and just breaks it down into manageable, governable numbers. They went into obsessive, scientific detail. They were chemically analyzing local water sources down to the exact fraction of a grain. They praised the pure waters of the Bari Doab Canal for having just over 8 grains of solid contents per gallon, while heavily criticizing the highly alkaline well water, which, by the way, was extensively used by the local population. It's a really fascinating look at how a colonial power uses hard science to assess and manage newly acquired territory. And this clinical documentation extended right into public health. The authors note that while they considered the extreme climate of Lahore to be somewhat invigorating, the reality for the local population was incredibly grim. The city suffered heavily from malaria, which they described as remittent and intermittent fever, along with consumption, pneumonia, and these severe post-monsoon cholera epidemics. And again, all of this is recorded with the aloof precision of a medical ledger.
Section 4. Poetry and Resistance. The native voice.
But a city is way more than its weather patterns and water chemistry, right? Which brings us to the vibrant cultural reality operating just beneath the British administrative gaze.
It's fascinating how the British viewed the culture of Lahore. They selectively romanticized the ancient mythological past of the city. The travelogue quotes old poets, calling Lahore a city of enchantment, tied to the romantic legends of Lalla Rookh. They loved the idea of historic Lahore, but they were largely deaf to the voices of the actual people living in it at that very moment.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, the travelogue authors did include some translations of the local vernacular press and street ballads. When we contrast that romanticized British view with a local Punjabi ballad from the exact same era, the difference is totally jarring. The native population wasn't singing about mythological enchantments, they were actively lamenting the harsh, bureaucratic realities of British rule. They were complaining about the new roads and the terrible Ferengis' dread regulations, Ferengi, of course, being a term for foreigners.
The travelogue inadvertently captures how folklore was this vital mechanism for Punjabis to voice their grievances. The local songs complained that, in the old days, men had riches, but now they were poor. They lamented that scoundrels and vagabonds swagger about, and they openly mocked the new sanitation contractors and municipal rules. To the locals, this didn't feel like modernization. It felt like a direct assault on their traditional way of life.
And it gets so much heavier. The sources show that these poems weren't just complaining about annoying municipal zoning laws. They reflected profound, agonizing trauma. The verses speak of the people being crushed, describing immense tyranny, and lamenting that they hanged 10,000 of the innocent. This poetry was the emotional counterweight to the sterile clinical data of the British administrators. It was a population actively processing the absolute devastation of conquest.
Section 5. Conclusion. Who holds the pen?
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at how these two radically different perspectives coexist, because analyzing the source of information is just as important as the information itself. The British administrators recorded the structure of the city, its rainfall, its water tables, its architecture, with incredible precision. But it was the locals, through their ballads and poetry, who recorded the city's soul and its suffering. As Dr. Mubarak Ali points out, without the modern forward to balance the inherent bias of that 1860 text, we'd literally only have half the story.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder long after we finish up today. When we look back at the historical record of any civilization, how much of what we accept as absolute historical truth is merely the perspective of the people who just happen to hold the pen? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.